One of the great mysteries of World War II was the senseless aerial destruction of Axis-occupied cities by Allied bombers. These weren't bomb strikes to support ground forces, but carpet bombing raids on city centers. Several cities in Axis-occupied China, Italy, Yugoslavia, and France were blasted by American mass bombings. These events are inexplicable and thus overlooked by historians. 3 large Chinese cities were destroyed by mass American bombing raids. See the tale linked below. Italy switched sides in 1943, but the Allies still pummeled several Italian cities, to include Rome, as described in the tale linked below. The Germans invaded Yugoslavia in April 1941. Years later, several large American strategic bombing attacks were conducted on Yugoslav cities occupied by the Germans. In theory, rail yards and Germans were targeted, but bombers dropped from high altitudes to avoid ground fire, so bombs hit civilian areas and caused little disruption to German operations. Allied bombings caused far more damage than German bombings in 1941. The Allied bomber commands knew these were ineffective, wasted resources, and killed thousands of innocent Yugoslavs, but bombings continued. The Allies sent commandos to recruit, arm, and train Yugoslav guerrillas, called partisans, to attack German soldiers, military installations, and rail lines. They tied up tens of thousands of German troops at little cost. Allied bombers often flew over Yugoslavia to bomb targets in Germany and Romanian oil facilities. Many bombers went down over Yugoslavia, and these partisans rescued hundreds of American pilots and helped them escape. Allied bombings disrupted this effort, as it angered Yugoslav fighters and helped the German propaganda campaign that the British and Americans were everyone's enemy. The Yugoslav capital of Belgrade was a transportation hub for the region and an attractive target for bomber generals. On Easter Sunday, April 16, 1944, 600 Allied bombers blasted Belgrade. The first bomb struck at 11:26 a.m. when the city center was packed with Christians attending Easter services. No military targets were hit during this carpet bombing. Bombs hit religious and cultural structures, as well as several schools and hospitals. Over 1,200 civilians were killed and some 5,000 wounded, while only 18 German soldiers perished. The bombers returned the next day to drop another 1,500 tons of bombs on Belgrade. Several other cities in Yugoslavia were hit during this 2-day Easter bombing rampage. This slaughter was an obvious political attack for unclear reasons. 10 smaller bombing attacks on Belgrade occurred over the following months, even though intelligence reports noted they had no effect on German military operations and outraged Yugoslavs. Historians remain puzzled since there were no major Allied ground combat operations in the region and no German combat units in cities, just second-rate security forces. Nevertheless, senseless aerial bombings continued and damaged popular support for the Americans and British. Numerous cities in France were destroyed by Allied bombs. During the invasion of Normandy in June 1944, Allied bombers killed nearly as many French civilians as German soldiers. These deaths can be excused as collateral damage on a battlefield. However, other French cities were destroyed far from battlefields. The coastal resort city of Royan in southwestern France was destroyed by American bombers 3 weeks prior to the end of the war. The U.S. Air Force Historical Studies Office noted that on April 15, 1945, 1,161 heavy bombers destroyed 22 defensive installations in the area. Most of these installations were built with thick concrete and were hit but not destroyed as they protected 5,000 German soldiers. Royan was adjacent and some 2,000 French citizens were slaughtered by bombs. This map illustrates the madness of this bombing mission. By April 15, 1945, Allied ground forces were dashing across central Germany and rounding up German POWs. All of France was secure, except for 3 coastal ports like Royan, which was so far from the battlefield it doesn't show on this map. This bombing occurred 10 months after the invasion of France, and an official surrender was expected in a few days. Some think this bombing was done to test a new type of bomb, now known as napalm, that burned up Royan. The city was totally destroyed, with only 9 houses left standing. Historian Howard Zinn was a bombardier on that mission.
I was in the Air Force for 2.5 years and dropped bombs on Berlin, dropped bombs on various cities in Germany and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and even bombed a little town in France towards the very end of the war. And this was a strange one, and one that had a very profound effect on me later as I thought about it. And the war actually in Europe was about over. It was a few weeks from being over, and everybody knew it. But we were awakened in the middle of the night, and they told us we were going to bomb this little town in France because there were several thousand German soldiers around the town. They weren't doing anything, weren't bothering anyone, they were just waiting for the war to end, but we were going to go over and bomb them. Now, the one odd thing about it, they told us we were not going to carry the usual demolition bombs, 500-pound demolition bombs. We were going to carry instead 30 canisters, 100-pound canisters of jellied gasoline. That's what it was called. Of course, later I learned this was napalm, the first use of napalm in the European theater. And you know, when you're bombing from 30,000 feet, you don't hear anything, you don't see anything, you don't know what's happening to people down there. You don't hear people screaming, you don't see blood, you don't see mangled limbs, none of that. And several thousand people were killed. Germans were killed, French were killed, and it wasn't until really after the war, maybe after I learned about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and began to think about bombing and began to question the total goodness of the good war. Only then did I go think about Royan and that bombing.
There are 2 reasons behind this genocidal behavior. The first was bureaucratic competition fueled by American General Hap Arnold. He was chief of the Army Air Forces throughout World War II and the force behind the U.S. Army Air Corps that grew from 20,000 in 1935 to over 2 million soldiers in 1944. This was accomplished with a massive public relations effort that promoted air power propaganda. Huge bombing raids made great news stories. This was shown in the great post-war bomber movie called Command Decision, when an Army Air Corps general dismisses concern about aircraft losses. He describes the political struggle to expand the Army Air Corps and states the Germans aren't the only enemy. Air Corps generals fought the U.S. Army and Navy for funding and manpower and needed big bombing raids to win arguments. Another factor is the psychopathic culture that developed among Air Corps generals as they showed little concern for the random death and destruction caused by mass aerial bombing. General Curtis Lemay shocked people with a total lack of empathy for innocence and enthusiasm for atomic bombs. In the classic movie Dr. Strangelove, his character was excited to start a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Another movie, The War Lover, starred a psychopathic American bomber pilot played by Steve McQueen. His love for war and destruction remains common among American generals to this day.
Some men love war, the way others love women. This is the story of both kinds.
There's only 2 things that mean anything to me, flying and women.
In that order?
In any order, or both together.
So you're enjoying the war?
I like my work.
Work?
Lady, I belong to the most destructive group of men the world has ever known. That's my work.